Welcome to the Sencast. My name is Dale Pickles. I'm the host of the Sencast and one of the directors at B Squared. If this is your first Sencast, then welcome. The aim of the Sencast is really simple. We want to reach lots of people and help everyone, including me, learn more about special educational needs and disability. In this episode, my guest is Kim Griffin. Kim is an occupational therapist and founder of Griffin OT. Kim has been working in SEND for the last 20 years with a focus on autism, sensory processing and dyspraxia. And this episode, we're just answering a very simple question, which might be simple, but maybe the answer is more complicated. What is an OT? The Sencast is created and produced by us here at B Squared, and I normally mention our assessments software on this podcast, but this time we're going to talk about Eversense, our evidence and parent communication system. Eversense feels like social media, so it's extremely easy to understand and use. It's extremely secure, a safe place to share evidence and learning with parents or external professionals. And it's also a great way to capture pupil voice or to use as your homeschool diary or reading diary. Visit the B Squared website to find out more about Eversense or click on the meeting link in the show notes to book a meeting with me to take you through Eversense. Now, let's get on with the podcast. On this week's show, we're discussing what is an OT, and I've already know that means occupational therapist. My guest this week is Kim Griffin. Kim is an occupational therapist and founder of Griffin OT. Kim has been working in SEND for the last 20 years with a focus on autism, sensory processing and dyspraxia. She also provides additional training and support for sensory processing and motor skills like handwriting on her website, griffinot.com. Welcome back to the podcast, Kim.
Hi, Dale. It's great to be here.
Excellent. You are an OT.
I am an OT. I've been an OT for over 20 years now.
So what is an OT?
So I think classically when people hear the word occupation and occupational therapist, their head immediately jumps to thinking about their job. Because this day and age, when we hear the term occupation, we think about work.
Yeah.
When OT was first founded, they were using the term occupation more linked to being occupied. So they were initially working with more so in mental health wards, and they were finding that I'm going to say patients at this time because it was many years ago and they were patients on the wards. The ones that were given craft activities and things to do to keep their time occupied were getting better outcomes and where their health was improving quicker. So occupational therapy initially came from the concept of keeping your time occupied. So occupation, occupational. These days, I think the term activity is a much better way to describe what we do. Occupational therapists support you to be independent in whichever activity is important to you and whichever activity you need to do to get on with your day-to-day life. So that could be being able to have a shower. It could be being able to make your bed. It might be driving your car. For children, I know this is our Send podcast, it's being able to pack your school bag in the morning. It's being able to get your lunchbox out of your bag and open it up and open up all the little packets in it. It's being able to play with your friends on the playground. It's being able to write in class because you need to hold a pencil. So it's all of those day-to-day occupations or activities. Occupational therapists focus on supporting you to be independent with them or to be able to do them sort of successfully throughout your day-to-day life.
Now I know why. The occupation part was always always been weird.
Yeah.
My father-in-law, when he was 98 or so, broke his hip.
Mm-hmm.
Had to go off into hospital and was in a unit and had to be assessed by an OT before he was allowed to go home. Could he do all of these things independently?
Yeah, and they would have gone in and they would have probably done a shower assessment because typically is the person, and that a shower assessment, they're not just looking at the ability to shower, but OTs are the only allied health professionals. So allied health professionals include speech therapists, dietitians, physiotherapists, psychologists kind of fit in there as well, we are the only professionals that focus on both mental and physical health and mental and physical and cognitive sort of assessment. So when your father-in-law was having his OT assessment, they would have been looking at, can he get dressed? Can he sequence things correctly? Is he using soap on him instead of something else like toothpaste? Has he used the soap, not the toothpaste, to wash himself? Is his balance okay? Is he able to safely get in and out of the shower? Can he wipe himself correctly and, sort of maintain balance whilst doing that? And then the second part of that assessment probably included looking at his home to make sure his shower at home met his needs as they were now, because he might have had a bath but could no longer, when you've broken your hip, it's very difficult to sit down in a bath, particularly if you've had a hip replacement or surgery done. So the OT might have looked at modifying the space to enable him to be independent.
And also he had all the, can you feed yourself?
Yep.
He did all of that.
Yeah.
So literally, and they had a kitchen there, which you go and sit in, but they literally go, this is where we do our assessments.
Yeah.
And it's great because I could explain this to my daughter.
Yeah.
And we went to a careers evening, my daughter, who's in year 8, and she wants an OT. And the OT sat there listening to me as I explained it, and she went, that's very good.
Yeah. It's
helping people live a normal life.
Yeah.
Is the really short version.
Yeah. And it's you tend to the only people that tend to know what OT is people that have interacted with an OT before. It's not something like, teacher or nurse. People just genuinely know what that is. And I must admit, there are times, particularly when I was younger, if I was out and I just was not, if I didn't have the energy, I would just say I was a nurse or a teacher, just to not have to sort of go through the discussion, which is maybe not doing greatness for my profession, but there were certainly days where I didn't need to hear people complain about how much they hated their work. And sort of having to reframe that for them.
I think, well, this is the thing, because I've been in SEM for so long, I think, we all know OTs, but perhaps actually we don't.
No, I mean, to be honest,
I'll be sitting there going, is my monitor at the right height?
Yeah, and to be fair, OTs, like occupational therapists, are actually fantastic at doing work assessments and workplace assessments. And there are OTs that work in occupational health. So I still get called occupational health by some people, and I'm not occupational health. My expertise is working with children. But there are occupational therapists who specialise in occupational health. And I think we are exceptionally good at that role because we've got all of the training to support you to be successful at your job. So it's not like we never work in supporting people with their job, but it's certainly only sort of one specialty area. It's like if you do engineering, there's so many different areas you can specialize in, or even teaching. You could be an early years teacher, you could be a primary school teacher, you could go into SEND, you could be secondary. If you're in secondary, you then specialize in a subject. So occupational therapists are exactly the same. We might specialize in children or adults. We might specialize more in mental health. We might specialize more in orthopaedics. So the therapist you saw was it your dad? Father-in-law. They would be specialists probably in orthopaedics, because that's where you end up if you have a hip operation.
Yep.
My first placement was in orthopaedics, so I did hips and I did hands. So yeah, occupational therapists, there's not sort of this typical, someone asked me to describe a typical day in the life of an OT, and my typical day is very different to colleagues of mine or friends of mine who did OT when we trained, because they've gone into different areas. So their typical day looks very, very different to mine.
I suppose, yeah, because you're going to have hospital-based. Mm-hmm. You're going to have those who are almost like linked to special schools, and that's all they. You literally. I'm going to call you a drifter, but you do lots of different things.
Yeah. We can, like social care has got OTs because it's sort of looking at all the equipment and the housing adaptations, schools, health, community services, and depending on how that's funded, sometimes that's working for the local authorities, sometimes they're sort of health-based community teams. But and we do support people across the lifespan. So there's OTs working in neonatal intensive care units with premature babies, and there's OTs working with older adults. So it's completely across the lifespan. So it is a really fulfilling career, because there's so many different areas you could go into. And even though I've been specialized in paediatrics for so long, I'm still learning stuff every day. I'm still coming across something that's different. I'm going into a school that's got a different set of resources, or I'm working with a family who's got a different set of resources. And I'm having to continually kind of think through, well, what is going to support this individual? Like, it's not just here's the kind of cookie cutter plan. It's like, well, what's important to this individual? What are the resources they have? What's the time maybe frame that they need to get something done in? Like, and adjusting to sort of support them as an individual. So it's certainly a very interesting and rewarding career because there's so many different facets.
So, okay, I'm going to ask these questions.
hmm
When should you use a TA within a school? What things should you use? And I'll come to what do they use you for?
Okay, so
Because often that can be a different.
a TA or an OT?
So OTA, did I say TA?
You did say TA, but
I have
I'm
no
happy
idea
to
why.
comment on like how OTs and TAs can link
No
together.
What should a school use an OT for?
So, occupational therapists coming into schools can be really helpful to support you. Firstly, like there's a real push, and I know this is in both education and therapies, to look at the triangle model of sort of universal, targeted, and specialist provision. And whilst there's usually not an engagement hugely at that tier one universal level when you're maybe thinking of your handwriting policy in school, or you're thinking about what furniture you might put into your classrooms, or you're thinking about what fidget toys and chew toys might be the standard stock that you've got available, or if you're going to have wobble cushions or things like that. So I personally think there's a really good role for an OT there, is that sort of discussing on a universal level, like what are the general things that we're going to have available to support kids that might have fine motor skill delays, to support kids that might have handwriting needs, to support kids that have got sensory differences and sensory needs in the classroom. Also, I think unfortunately, we don't get called in anywhere near as much as we could, but supporting kids with play. So, supporting kids, particularly in the early years, that are not necessarily playing with toys or playing with their peers in a developmentally expected way. So, play is the biggest occupation that kids have. So, it's something that OTs do cover in their training because it's we talk about work, rest, and play. Well, young kids, it's play, play, and rest. So it's 2/3 of their kind of their engagement time. It is through play. So yeah, there's that piece around, and I know that the availability of OT is challenging for many schools, but I do think there's a piece around that getting the baseline provision, sort of universal provision, we can support with that. Then most of what people would be more familiar with is the more targeted and specialist provision. So when there is a child who's maybe struggling with their behavior because they're being overloaded by sensations, or when there is a child who's struggling with their fine motor skills or their dressing skills or toileting or their handwriting, that tends to be more when OTs are sort of brought in to do more of an assessment and then provide recommendations and strategies to support.
So the thing is, where they should be used is probably more on that proactive side.
Like there's the reality is there's a need across the board. So it's not just, and I'm finding more and more a lot of services are providing that more universal training is available and not necessarily having the capacity to maybe do some more of the targeted stuff. And I know that very much comes down to lack of funding, lack of availability of therapists, and just the demand that is there and the need. There's an interesting call actually by NRMH, whatever the National Health Research Council is. They're actually looking to find out what the demand for therapies is across the board in schools because we don't know. We don't know what demand there is in EHCPs across the UK. And I think they're only looking at the EHCP piece of the puzzle. But if you extrapolate that across to SEND, that there is a demand and there is a need there. So the capacity to do proactive stuff is often lower because we're trying to support that more specialist and targeted stuff. But in an ideal world, it would be amazing if OTs were even collaborating with policymakers to kind of support how to integrate. When should a child be learning to write? It's certainly not when they're 4 years old, because developmentally that's too early, even though that's what the curriculum's expecting. You could speak to any OT and any teacher, to be honest, to say, or any early years teacher at least, to say, that's really early, and these are some of the things that can support kids along that journey. So yeah, it would be great to have OTs in those more proactive roles, but it can be challenging to prioritize that on both sides sometimes.
I was just thinking, because sometimes with an EHCP is kind of something isn't supported, and then a load of support goes in at the very end, which should have been there from the start. So it's almost like they're kind of getting left behind. But probably OT is not like that. It's not like they started to have difficulty handwriting, then it got worse. It was kind of never there in the first place. I was thinking with that research they're doing around the EHCPs is kind of doing that tiered response. So if this is what is really needed here, then we need stages up here. But actually, that's not really it. Actually, what is maybe coming much later should have been there much earlier, but it's the same support, I guess, which is needed.
In some ways, yeah. So like handwriting is a good example of something that doesn't, and unless there is an underlying neurological something going on. So say a child's got Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, their handwriting will deteriorate as they get older. Typically, if a child is in year 3 and they've got really rubbish handwriting, they didn't just turn up in year 3 and suddenly have poor handwriting. Typically, they weren't the kids that were colouring in when they're in reception. They were avoiding all of the kind of craft tables and all of the early mark making, and then they were struggling a bit in reception with their writing, and that has just sort of continued through to year 3. So the more earlier support that can go in place for those kids, the better their outcomes are longer term. Like all of the research on early intervention shows that dollar for dollar, like there was some amazing stuff done in New Zealand where I think they were looking at for every dollar spent on early intervention, they saved $7. And this research is a little bit out of date now, but like they were saving $7 in the long term because they were sort of supporting very, very early on. And again, that's not necessarily there with wait lists and things like that. You might have a child who's sent in and it might take a year or 2 years to be seen. And that then, unfortunately, creates another layer of need because the child, we'll stick with handwriting as the example, say they're struggling with it, their self-esteem then drops. Some kids might just avoid it. Other kids, you might get behavioral reactions because they find it challenging. So therefore they don't want to do it. And their way to get out of doing it is to kick off. So it layers in a whole extra level of need on top of the original need. And I see that all the time with a lot of the kids. And then then they're just completely refusing to write because it's so challenging for them.
So my nephew had dysgraphia and he always answered the questions in the shortest way possible.
Yeah.
And then when he finally got a laptop, he had to relearn how to answer his questions in the way that everyone was expecting him to.
Yeah.
Plus all that reluctance. And the thing was, this was like a 5-year battle to get to the laptop.
Yeah.
And his self-esteem and everything, it really impacted his learning.
And it's the self-esteem and it's all of that piece. So that's like I'm a true believer in early intervention and also getting universal provision correct, because if the universal provision's there, you're scooping up the kids that have maybe got a little bit of a need, but it's also hopefully identifying the kids that do have more of a need to then get the support going in place. But that's in an ideal world. And I appreciate that there are lots of pressures everywhere that make that ideal world far from a reality in some places.
So we've talked about handwriting, and when I think of OTs, I'm generally thinking handwriting and physics. But what are the areas that OTs are supporting in schools around? Like, let's start with the EHCPs.
Yeah. Okay, so a lot of the targets you'll see on EHCPs linked to OT, they fit into the sensory and physical section is where they typically are. Occasionally you'll get some in cognition and learning, but usually they're in sensory and physical. And there'll be things like independence with self-care. So that might be dressing, that might be toileting, that might be using a knife and fork. It's tricky with some of those because I would say that they're in some ways linked more to home and health than necessarily education. But if a child's not able to, well, we don't have to change into our PE kit. It used to be pre-COVID, it used to be so much easier to work on dressing because the kids would all change on PE day into their PE kits. So there was more functional options to practice dressing in schools. Whereas nowadays it's more linked to kind of putting your jumper on and off, putting your coat on and off, and some of that kind of external layers. And then, so that's kind of the functional skills. It's pulling in sort of functional tool use in classrooms. So things like using scissors as the kids get older, using rulers. I was in a class the other day and they were learning how to use a protractor. So learning to use a protractor is actually a really challenging skill if the child's maybe got motor skill or perceptual difficulties. Getting the protractor in the right spot, understanding which line they're reading off. So obviously it's got a 0. These were half protractors. So they had 0 to 180 and then 0 to 180, and depending on what side you'd started on. So for kids with perceptual difficulties, that can be quite hard. So it's learning some of those more functional tool use activities. And then the other piece is, well, we've mentioned play for younger kids, and then we're also looking at sensory needs and self-regulation. So, and that is often on the children that have got autism spectrum disorder as their primary need on their EHCP. We know that most autistic children have got some sensory needs because that's just what the research is showing us, that sensory processing differences are very, very common in autism. So it's then identifying those needs, identifying what environmental modifications might happen, identifying what regulation strategies might help that child throughout their day. So do they need, and we're going to talk about regulation in an upcoming podcast, so we'll go through that a bit more, and sensory needs more specifically and sensory supports. But and often that will be a piece on the EHCP as a target. One caveat I'll put onto that is quite often those targets are sort of written as though the sensory support will be this magical solution that will support the child to be able to access their learning at all times. But the reality is we need to look at the child overall and say, well, is the lesson actually at their cognition level? Are their speech and language needs being met? Because if the lesson's too hard for them, no amount of movement break or sensory circuit or weighted blanket is going to help that child access the lesson.
Yeah.
Like, it will help get them in a regulated state if the environment and the lesson is appropriate and differentiated correctly for them. Whereas if the environment and everything else is still not right for them, then the sensory stuff is, it's a Band-Aid that's not really going to make any difference in my experience.
I love my analogies, and I'm trying to work out what would be a really good analogy for that. And I'm guessing, imagine being told you're going to a Bon Jovi concert.
Mm-hmm.
You get there, you're hyped up, you're in the arena, you've got your pint of beer, and Barney comes on.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't be.
It's the same experience. You're at a concert. He might even be singing Bon Jovi songs.
Yeah, it's
Barney.
not.
But if that's not you, you are going to get angry. You are going to be going, but it's a concert.
Yeah.
You're here.
Yeah.
You're in the arena. You've got your beer. You've got your beer. You've got everything you need. Just one thing's changed. Yeah, but I wanted that.
Yeah.
And how you would react to that is kind of that. Yeah, technically there is a concert, but actually that's not my level.
Well, yeah. Well, it's not what I want. It's not what I was expecting. But I think for our SEN, well, actually, I think a better analogy would actually be if you're expecting an English concert and then someone came on and started singing in Chinese and you didn't speak Chinese. It wouldn't matter. You wouldn't be able to understand or engage with what they were saying because you don't speak that language. And I think that's the same for our SEND kids that have got developmental language disorder needs, or have got, they're working at, say, a year 1 level, but they're in a year 5 classroom. No amount of weighted blanket is going to make them access the year 5 learning. Like the learning is just at a level that is too high for them.
I think as a child, we went to a couple of different shows, various different things, and my parents took me to a ballet once, and it was in the intermission, and I said, when's the story going to start? When are they going to start speaking? And it's like, they dance. I'm going,
Yeah.
This dancing is in the story. And I'm going, the story's in the dance. I'm going,
Yeah, so you clearly
what?
missed it because it wasn't your brain does not perceive the story that's in the ballet.
Now, if someone
Yeah.
told me you've got to watch the dancing because that's going to tell you the story,
Yeah.
I might have gone, okay, so who's... But I was just watching people dancing going,
Yeah.
that's lovely.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. But I had no idea. And it's that sort of thing. It is your expectation. You're able to understand what's going on. Now, it might have been amazing. There might have been proper, really good ballerinas on the stage that day. I could not tell you.
Yeah.
It was just interesting, but a bit boring. And I didn't get it. I was waiting for the story.
Yeah. And a sensory diet wouldn't have helped you get it anymore because you still would have been bored.
Yes.
And I think the other piece to add on to that, it's not necessarily just the classroom, but it's thinking about what else is going on for that child outside of home as well. Because there are some kids that are coming in that are coming in from really challenging home lives. Maybe they're in temporary accommodation, or maybe, they haven't their parents are, grandparents sick, or like there's things that are going on at home life that might make that child turn up to school just not in a headspace where they're able to learn. And yes, sensory strategies and supports can help maybe with their regulation, but they're not necessarily going to magically make them ready to learn because they're thinking about whatever that other thing, or they haven't slept. Like those things are kind of there, and we'll talk. I feel like we've digressed slightly off from OT, so I'm going to bring it back to another question. What's your next OT? What is an OT question?
So you keep talking about working with the child and supporting them and regulation and sensory breaks and all that lot. How much kind of do you get to put in with the teachers explaining all of that? Or is it a case of you write a report and you're done?
To be honest, it really depends on the service and the OT and the level of hours that are commissioned in and things like that. So I am quite fortunate in most of the schools that I work in that they buy in enough time for me to link in with the teachers. I personally, as an OT these days, I don't do the only one-to-one stuff I do without a staff member present is when I'm doing my assessment stuff, because there's not a huge amount for the TAs to learn or see if I'm doing assessments. Whereas when I'm doing treatments and supports, I expect that there is the child's teaching assistant there, or the teacher. It's usually the teaching assistant though, because 90% of the time it's the teaching assistant that is putting those strategies in place at school. So I personally work as closely as I can with them, because my experience has shown me if they don't understand, if they're not on board, stuff's not going to be done. And I also tend to do 1 or 2 sessions where I demonstrate, but then the 3rd or 4th session, I expect the TA to run the session so I can see what's going on, so that I can make sure that what I've asked to happen is happening. Because there's so many times where I've gone in and I've looked at stuff and I'm like, oh, actually, that's not what's written on the plan, or that's not how I demonstrated it. Like you're not doing what I've seen. I appreciate I'm quite unique in having that time and being commissioned in that way. Unfortunately, a lot of the time there are just reports going into schools that teachers and TAs have got to sort of read and then implement. And a lot of time that comes down to the SENCO understanding and then supporting the TA to implement the support. And a lot of the training, there's a lot of the training available now, but a lot of it's online. A lot of the NHS trusts are providing online training for schools. And I know, like, you've got in your training, there's all sorts of bits and pieces, and there's a few other training places that are supporting with that. But it really depends. But for me, if you don't have the teachers and TAs on board, it's just not going to get done. So for me, it's incredibly important to have buy-in, and it's also what unfortunately can happen, and I know this primarily comes down to time and capacity. I also make sure I understand the school environment and what resources are there, so I can tailor my recommendations to match what they have, rather than giving in a program that says, oh, you need a yoga ball, and the school doesn't have a yoga ball. So I personally always check with the SENCO kind of what's a relevant recommendation for the school given your resources that you have, or, can you purchase? For example, one of the girls I'm working with, she's learning to feed herself. She was knocking the bowl off the table all the time. So we needed to get some sticky bowls, which was a very easy thing to get. And it turned out that a staff member had some, because, they're a very common piece of kit that
Yeah.
you only need for that period of time where your child is learning at the start, and then they're useless and you don't need sticky bowls anymore. So we got them and we put them in, but it's having that dialogue of, I think we need X, Y, and Z, and you don't have X, but you've got Y, so we'll focus on that. But yeah, I find that facilitates more success when I'm linking in. The more I can link in with schools and make it individualized to the resources and the space, because every school has got different space. I've got one school that used to be a 2-form entry that's now a 1-form entry that's got spare classroom space coming out of their ears, and I have another school that's like a 1-form entry with absolutely not a spare space at all. So it's linking in with that as well.
So one of the things is when we built Eversense and we talked to the things, we found out that lots of schools, like the SALT would come in.
Yes.
They'd work with the child
Yes.
and then leave.
Yes.
And then maybe the teacher or the parents have no idea what's going on, so no idea what to practice. And one of the things we've put in our system is we call a learning opportunity.
Yes.
So they can record, actually this week we've been practicing this. Can you make sure you practice this?
Yeah.
Because
yes,
if you're going in and going, right, this is what you need to do, and you're doing it with a child and there's no staff, anyone present, and they go back to that classroom and they go, right, I need my sensory break.
Yeah.
That's what I need. I've been told it. I do this.
Yeah.
And it's not happening.
Yeah. And that's where the integrate. And I do think, like, in terms of putting that stuff in, the OTs, they are hopefully kind of linking back into the teacher and giving that feedback in terms of this. Yeah, this is the recommendation I've made, and this is how to make it practically available. And I suppose the advice to school, the advice I would give to schools is, if the OT has suggested stuff you don't have resources for, or that doesn't fit with the space you've got, you can go back to them and say, like, I'm really sorry, you've suggested 5 things. We can only do 1 of them because of X, Y, and Z. Can you give us another 4 that fit with our circumstances so that it can be adjusted to match the school's resources and capacity?
And I suppose in the long run, if actually the 5 original ones you suggested are the best thing and the other ones are really just compromise, it should really not really having impact. That's, I suppose, when you come to the annual review again at the end of the year and those recommendations go in to be able to do that, you need X, Y, and Z, and that should be provisioned by the authority.
Yeah.
In the dream world.
In the dream world. But there are... we do have, schools have got limitations on space and, and some schools have got great trim trails that you can say, oh, go out and use that for the break, or kind of, it's just knowing what resources the school has and what's realistic for them to bring in. Or, when is the hall free? Every school's got a hall, but they all use it really differently. So sometimes it's booked out all day for PE. Usually it's got lunch-ins. So just those nuances of kind of, okay, the hall's normally free at 9 o'clock, so do this at 9 o'clock when the hall is free, and working. I just find you're much more successful when it's tailored to what is actually available and in the school.
So we've talked about kind of OT and EHCP, and we talked about lots about classroom assistants being involved. What kind of input do you have outside of that EHCP realm? So when there are, they need support, but it's not at that level, and it's probably not individually funded.
Yeah. So that, to be absolutely honest, that really depends on the area of the country and the way the school's buying in OT. So I know in a couple of my schools that I've got my EHCP kids and they're kind of my priority, but then the extra time I have, the Senko is like, oh, can you just clap eyes on this kid, or can you give us some suggestions for this child? And they're on the send register, and and we always get parental permission and stuff, but that's kind of, the school buys in, I suppose, a little bit extra time. There's a bit of reserve time in my buy-in time to sort of support those extra kids. All local authorities do take referrals for children that don't have EHCPs. Unfortunately, there's a real discrepancy in terms of what is provided for and what capacity services have. A lot of the time it's maybe a school visit and they talk to the Senko and provide some ideas. A lot of local authorities you have to do a term or two of the standard recommendations that we've got, and then you can access and put a referral in for additional support. If I'm honest, every single area of the country is slightly different on what the NHS teams offer. So, and usually it's the NHS teams that are doing the service into schools. There's very few local authorities, if any, that actually employ OTs in a way that could just go and support schools as on an ad hoc basis. It's like the old specialist teaching services. Like most local authorities have got rid of that service, or it's a service that schools now need to buy in rather than a service that was readily available. And I think that's very sad, because I think they were a really good resource that schools could get some more support around. So I'm very mindful that it can be hard for schools to get that extra support, and it's very different in different local authorities and areas. So I don't have a clean answer for that for you.
Generally isn't a clean answer when it involves different local authorities. So next question, I think you've touched on this, but just turn it into a question on its own, is how can schools really maximise what they get from their OT?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's having a clear ask when the OT comes in. So what is the clear problem that you want support with? What's the child? What's the primary need that you're wanting the OT to address with that time, or that assessment that they're doing, or the consultation? And then it's allocating a staff member who's going to be responsible for implementing the recommendations. That's where I see stuff fall down a lot of the time, is that the recommendations might be made, but no one is allocated to running with them or picking them up. And ideally, documenting when that's occurring and what change it's making, because then when the OT comes back in, you can say, oh, we tried X, Y, and Z, but it didn't help, or we tried X, Y, and Z and it did help. It's great. We don't need any more support, or we do need more support. And I think there is a challenge, in my experience at least, there is a challenge in getting some of that therapy's time documented. And I do find kids are doing the same thing ad nauseum forever. So that would be something else. Like if you've had an OT assessment when the child's in year 1 and they've recommended 5 things, those 5 things are not going to be the right things for the child to be doing in year 3. Like the child should be progressed on, and that's what I've done. I've been very specific in like my fine motor program and my handwriting program to progress kids on, because the frequency with which I see kids doing the same pegboard, the same threading, the same tweezer activity for like every couple of days throughout every year of school they're in, it's that they're not progressing. So there's that piece around making sure you're going back to the OTs and asking for progression once the kids are successful with the activity that they've maybe been given to practice.
And even if they're not successful, it's going, okay, asking them, well, why not? If we've been doing the same thing for 3 years and we're still not getting it, there's something else we've missed.
Yeah. We need to be doing this. We need to be doing this differently.
Is there any other advice you'd give to schools around OT-ness?
Oh, just one thing. If you're buying in a private OT time, we need to be HCPC registered. And the bulk of OTs that are working, they will be HCPC registered. But one thing I find I always get asked if I do get asked for documentation, I always get asked for my practice certificate, like my university degree certificate. I can have one of them, but not be legally registered to practice in the UK. So it's like teacher registration. We need to be HCPC registered. If you are commissioning an OT in, that's what you need to ask for, not their degree certificate.
And HCP is Healthcare Professionals
Council. Yeah, it used to be They've added extra
HP
people
source.
in. Yeah, HP source.
I thought that's where you were going.
No,
HCPC.
No, they used to not have the health and care professionals. It just used to be health professionals. They've changed it. And I think the other thing I would say to schools is don't be afraid to ask for clarification if stuff's not working. Like I do see stuff. Sometimes there's like, well, the OT says they've got to have a fidget toy. So we've got this fidget toy, but it's causing a total chaos in the classroom. And it's like quite often that OT's maybe only seen the child once and they've not had the capacity to monitor what's going on with that. So if there's a recommendation that's not working, don't make sure you go back. Don't worry about going back to the OT and saying, actually, we've tried this, it's not working. Do you have something else? Like, just use that standard assessment that you use in school as part of your assess plan. Do review cycles, sort of do that with the OT recommendations, because at the end of the day, the recommendation should be helping. And if it's not making a difference, if it's not helping, it's potentially not the right recommendation for that child.
Fidget toys can be a bit of a contentious issue in schools.
Yeah.
To me, we all fidget at work. We all fidget. When you're on the phone, you play with something, you doodle, you do something. We fidget because we're on the phone. We can't do something else. We almost like recognize if I do something else, I'll stop listening. So I need a low level activity to occupy a little part of me so I can concentrate on the phone call. And you're not boring. Just be clear. If someone is using a fidget toy when you're talking, you're not boring. Yeah. It's the way their brain works. But to me, a fidget toy should be a personal thing which should not distract others.
Yeah.
So right now, I am twiddling with a little cufflink.
Yeah.
And Kim can't see it because it is out of sight. It's something I fiddle with. When I podcast and I'm on camera, I can fiddle with it on the desk because it's out of the camera view.
Yeah.
But it's that sort of thing. It is just something to occupy them. But it shouldn't be something that they're literally holding up and spinning for everyone behind them to see or the person next to them.
No.
There is a real reason for fidget toys, but it's got to be used correctly.
They do. And the research that's been done actually came out sort of suggesting they didn't make any difference to academic performance. But I do wonder, like, I don't think a fidget spinner is going to help you perform better on a math test. Like your ability to do the math test is kind of that innate ability to focus and do a test. But certainly if you've got kids that are constantly moving about and fidgeting with stuff on the desk, a fidget toy kid, a discrete individualized toy that's not distracting to the class and not distracting the kid, because some children will become so engrossed in their fidget toy that it becomes a distraction. It can, and some kids will say it keeps them out of trouble sometimes, like because they're not tapping their pen or fidgeting with their book.
I never got the fidget spinners.
Yeah,
I had a fidget cube when they came out. I thought that was really cool. I bought them from America. Got it. It was really expensive. And then about a week later, they were coming in from China, a quarter or a tenth of the price. It was like, but because when I play with something, it's something I'm doing constantly. The idea of spinning something and holding it, even just feeling it, it's like, no, I like things like that. So to me, whether you like it or not, personally, if you just because you don't need a fidget spinner doesn't mean someone else, or fidget toy doesn't mean someone else doesn't. And if they're using it like I am beneath the desk, or they're using it with bubble popping thing, if they're just using it quite discreetly.
This is Dale's plug. This is Dale's plug for fidget toys for every child that needs
Dale'sFidgetToys.com. No, it's just my daughter uses them, and she gets that it's a private, but yeah, she gets annoyed when others almost make a big show that I've got a fidget toy. So it's that you can literally go, and you get teachers getting really angry with fidget toys because they're distracting.
I suppose that comes back to classroom management as well, though, and having the appropriate toy. Like I've just switched out a ball for like a bendy fidget man because the ball was being dropped and causing a problem in the classroom.
Yeah.
And it is that if you're not using it discreetly, it's going on my desk.
Yeah.
You lose it. And typically the kids that find the benefit when you put those expectations and boundaries, behavioral boundaries on them, they use the fidget toy the way you've asked them to use it. So yeah,
I just remember taking pens apart and things like that when I was a child. It's like, got nothing to do. The math is easy. I'm going to take apart my pen into all this. It was like watching one of those army people take apart their guns and laying it all out and putting it back together. That's the sort of thing. It's just, it never occupied me. So I had to do something. So if you don't provide a fidget toy, they're likely to find something else.
Yeah, they'll tap the pen. There will be something going on in the class, or they'll start tapping the desk. I don't know if that's picked up on the mic.
Oh, that's definitely picked up on the mic.
So like there will be something going on. So
and it is by you choosing that fidget toy with them and how they use it. You've got that element of control. You can't just say no. They will do something else. They will be disruptive. They will be. If it helps them regulate and they can do it discreetly, win-win-win.
There's a post on my website that goes through fidget toys if you need more information on fidget toys. But I think we've covered most of OT. Yeah, your last question was good. I think, yeah. So my summary for OT is that we're not just talking about your job. We have got a huge level of expertise across both cognition, mental health, and physical health, and we can support children to be independent with whatever activities are important to them and their families and their school.
The bit I never got was I knew exactly what it was, and it was nothing to do with jobs. And I was like, why is it? But now I know.
Now you know.
It's you occupy your time.
Yeah.
It's that idea of occupation.
Yeah.
What's occupied you this weekend type thing.
Yes.
Rather than, yes, an occupation, which also takes up time.
It does take up time.
So it makes much more sense. So thank you for coming on the show today.
No worries. I look forward to next time.
Excellent. So Kim's, I've got all her social medias on her website. So if that's ask her about fidget toys, I'll get a link into there as well. And you'll find all of that on the show notes, which are, as always, wherever you listen to the show or on the website. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed already, click on that subscribe button. You can also follow us on social media, on Twitter. I actually saw a website refer to it as Twitter, formerly known as X, which was the wrong way around, but I prefer it being called Twitter again, but it's not, sadly. I'm going to keep talking about it being called wrong for probably another couple of years. Facebook, The Sendcast, and on Instagram, The Sendcast. And if you're looking for a simple, secure way to capture and share evidence of learning, or a way to capture people's voice, or a way to celebrate and share achievements, or just a simple, safe way to communicate with parents, you need to have a look at Eversense. Eversense is our evidence system that does so much more to help boost parental engagement. And as I mentioned in the podcast, using that for that learning opportunity. So any therapists who are coming in, they can record a nice selfie video, which then the teachers and the parents can access and support what is going on in that session throughout the rest of that week. To find out more about Eversense, visit the B Squared website, and you'll also find out about our online training, our CPD, read our blog, watch our webinars, and so much more. You'll find a link to the website and to book a meeting with me so I can take you through Eversense or any of the software in the show notes as well. So thank you for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Sendcast. It's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Bye, everyone.